I'm delighted to welcome everybody here today to the book launch for Hate Speech Against Women Online by Louise Richardson-Self, who is a very valued member of the School of Humanities. My name's Lisa Fletcher. I'm the head of the School of Humanities and a professor of English here at the university. I'll begin with an acknowledgement of country. Ya Pulingana. Those of us attending this evening's lecture in person meet in Nipaluna, Hobart. I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land and its surrounding seas and waterways, the Muwinina people. I encourage those of you who are joining us online from other places to reflect on the country where you are. The area around Nipaluna, Hobart was cared for and protected by the Muwinina people for thousands of years. They knew and honoured this country. I recognise that it is a deep privilege to live and work here in this extraordinary place which remains Palawa land. I pay my respects to past elders of the Muwinina people and to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community that continues to care for this country. I recognise the deep Palawa history and culture of this land and stand for a future that respects Palawa perspectives, their story, history and country. This evening's event has three parts. In a moment, I will introduce Professor Rufus Black, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Tasmania, who will launch Louise Richardson-Self's very important book, Hate Speech Against Women Online, Concepts and Countermeasures. Louise will then deliver a short talk to expand on the themes and the arguments of her book. Rufus and Louise will ensure that we have plenty of time for the third and final part of our event this evening, an opportunity for members of our live audience and those who are joining us online to ask questions of Louise in a question and answer session. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Rufus, the Vice-Chancellor and President of our university. Before joining the University of Tasmania, Rufus was Master of Melbourne University's Ormond College and an Enterprise Professor in the Department of Management and Marketing and a Principal Fellow in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Melbourne. Rufus holds degrees in law, politics and economics, ethics and theology from the University of Melbourne and Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. As head of the School of Humanities, I am immensely grateful for Rufus's passionate and ongoing support for the essential teaching and research that we do in the humanities at the university. I know that Rufus shares my very strong view that our society needs humanities scholars like Louise, people with the courage to take on the really hard questions and to seek new and better ways of living together. So I'll hand over now to Rufus, who will introduce and launch the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. If I can start with a word of introduction about Dr. Louise Richardson-Self. For those who don't know her impressive story, it is worth recounting. Dr. Louise Richardson-Self joined the University of Tasmania as a lecturer in philosophy and gender and diversity in July 2015. She was an Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Research Awardee from February 2019 to June 2022, funding from which enabled the publication of the book we're launching tonight, Hate Speech Against Women Online, Concepts and Countermeasures. She is also part of an ongoing Australian Research Council Discovery project, 2020 to 22, researching tensions between LGBTQ+ non-discrimination and religious freedom. In 2016, she was awarded the Max Crawford Medal, Australia's most prestigious award for achievement and promise in the humanities by the Australian Academy of Humanities for her research and public outreach on marriage equality. In 2017, she was a residential fellow of Humility and Conviction in Public Life project, hosted by the Humanities Institute at the University of Connecticut. In 2019, she was awarded the Australasian Association of Philosophers Annette Bayer Prize for an outstanding philosophical paper or book chapter published by an Australasian woman in the previous calendar year. Also in 2019, her research excellence was recognised by our university's College of Arts Law and Education Early Career Researcher Award. And prior to accepting her position at the University of Tasmania, Louise was a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Wollongong between 2014 and 15. She graduated with her PhD in philosophy from the University of Sydney in 2014 and was a research affiliate with the University of Sydney between 2014 and 15. And her undergraduate and honours studies were undertaken here at the University of Tasmania between 2006 and 2009. It is a real pleasure and privilege to be launching this book tonight and to have the opportunity to hear Louise expand upon it. This is, I think, a book that is both important and timely. I'm sure all of us have had unpleasant experiences in the online world. In fact, I certainly know them well. My own ones have been sufficiently unpleasant that I simply don't go there anymore. It can be a vile and difficult place. What Louise's book helps us to see is that while experiences like mine may be awful in many ways, they aren't actually experiences of hate speech. And that's because, as she outlines in elegant argument, hate speech is a group injustice. And understood in that way, hate speech can only be experienced by members of oppressed groups, including women, which is, of course, what this book is principally about. And what I experienced is directed at me as an individual, not at a whole group. So while it may make it unsafe for an individual, it doesn't make it unsafe for a group. But of course, that's exactly what hate speech does. And that distinction profoundly matters, as Louise so elegantly points out, in how we respond. For it points to how we go about addressing this hate speech and the critical importance of recognizing the systemic injustice, therefore, that lies behind it and what that means, in this case, for women. Louise's ability to enable us to understand these different dimensions of what it is to occupy an at times very unpleasant space is critical if we are then to navigate how we respond to what we find there. And taking it further, Louise makes a strong case for limiting the concept of hate speech to acts of systemic violence. It is this attribute which creates an online environment for women that is permeated by hostility and where the threat is always on the horizon. And this hostile online world is now so much more completely integrated into our world more generally. So the nature of the exclusion and the injustice only grows. And for those of us not experiencing it that way, it's vital to have it called to our attention in this particular and powerful way. And for those who want to create a just society, understanding the nature of this environment and what it means for women is essential. Louise brilliantly describes the topography of hate, and in doing so illuminates the deeply disturbing reality we face. We'll all read this book, of course, from different perspectives, whether it is a person subject to hate speech or someone disturbed by it but not subject to it. And wherever we read this book from, I am very confident we will all profit greatly by doing so. What's important is that Louise does not just diagnose a problem and describe it with a kind of philosophical precision that she is well recognized for. She also describes how we can respond, and that takes courage in any author. And it includes firm advice to move beyond speaking back. She helpfully maps the formal and legal responses, but does so in ways that reflect complexity and sophistication that makes every one of those explorations worth reading in its own right and helpful to anyone trying to form policy, whether at an organization or a societal level. But what I found particularly compelling is the reimagining that Louise calls for, including the invitation to challenge the way cyberspace is imagined. She offers a, I think, superbly insightful analysis of the opposing ideas of the internet, the supposedly realist view of cyberspace as a dark place filled with hateful trolls, versus a more hopeful place that is a new public sphere underpinned by free speech. In doing so, she reveals how these two ideas work together actually to enable and normalize hate speech against women. And clearly, that's not at all acceptable in a just society. By describing how cyberspace doesn't need to be defined by false polarities or the collapsing of categories that can and should be teased apart, Louise offers us the beginnings of creating a very different sort of online space where women can be safe. Indeed, she sees this as part of a cultural revolution, changing the cultural habits that are now responsible for hate and the oppression that women experience. In doing so, she reminds us that this can only occur when we as individuals become aware of and change our own habits and the way that they may consciously or unconsciously contribute to, in fact, making a space where hate can proliferate. It's a call to us all. It's a call to work collectively and holistically to reimagine the online world, indeed to reimagine our society, so that it is a space that is safe for all to occupy. So this book, I think, maps a territory of enormous importance to us as a society at this time and calls on the full breadth of the humanities' capabilities to illuminate the kind of ways in which we might respond. So it is with a great sense of privilege and also of timeliness that I'm delighted to be launching this book and inviting Louise to address us. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here, whether you're in person or online. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come and learn more about my recently published book. I would like to thank Lisa and Rufus greatly for their contribution to this event, and also acknowledge that this book was written in Lutruwita or Tasmania, and that sovereignty was never ceded, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us online or who are here in the room with us right now. So, something that's really hard is writing an entire book and then trying to summarize it in a 20-minute talk. So what I thought I would do is take the time to reflect on the things that I think I achieved in this book that are really substantively important contributions, and also things that make it distinctive as a work of philosophy. So the first thing that I did was create a really complicated diagram. This represents how I think societies function. So I've used a social imaginaries theory as the starting point for understanding the problem of hate speech, but actually it's at the root of any societal problem or functioning. Now, the ordinary meaning of the word imaginary does not apply here. It doesn't mean false or make-believe. It is rather a term of art. So we can believe things and they turn out to be true, and we can believe things and they turn out to be false. But what's important is what is the content of that thing that's creating shared meaning in our lives that helps us to structure our day-to-day activities, the people that we collaborate with, and so forth. I think one of the easiest examples to give of this is to talk about the influence of religion in people who are believers, but also people who are atheists. I can't prove definitively whether or not there is a God or to what kind of religion that God belongs, but nonetheless, groups of people share beliefs, and those beliefs are made meaningful in material ways in the world, including the types of buildings that we build, like churches, and in terms of the way that we dress, the norms about what's appropriate interaction for certain types of people. All of this kind of goes on in a taken for granted way. So you take that one example and then you add it to everything in society. Okay. So what a want to say is that some ways of seeing the world are more central than others. Some of them have greater support or are more socially embedded than others. These are marginal or fringe views, but they can permeate into a central imaginary. You can see those little circles, the tiniest circles there, almost touching the central imaginaries in the diagram. But ultimately, the dominant social imaginary is made up of the central imaginings in all of these domains of our life. And for the purposes of this book, the imaginaries that I'm interested in understanding are the ones that pertain to sex and gender, the ones that pertain to the digital sphere, and also an ethico-political imaginary, and to some extent a legal imaginary as well. So I've been interested to explore how these interconnections influence different aspects of society in ways that are motivating, but aren't necessarily backed by reasoned argument or a conscious attitude about a particular thing. Okay, so second, it gets less complicated from the first chapter to the last chapter. So second, after 6 months of data collection, I found that hate speech against women online tends to cluster around misogynistic images. And interestingly, they are misogynistic images that everyone in this room would already be familiar with before going onto the internet for the first time. So I found that women are figured in speech as sexual objects, as promiscuous, as mere female bodies, as bestial, as monsters, as abject, ugly, diseased, decrepit, and as failures as well, because lesbians are too masculine or because trans women aren't really women. Women are put down through the reiteration of familiar stereotypes. They're called gold diggers and crazy cat ladies and told that they belong in the kitchen making sandwiches. And of course, there is a lot of denigration of cancerous feminazis too. Now, as I said, these are images we're already familiar with. The terminology might change over time, but the central image remains the same. So we might say that they are ready to hand or default insults that we can fling into the ether almost spontaneously. But the fact that we can do this, I think, lends credibility to what I argue in chapter 2, which is that the central sexual imaginary is still a patriarchal one. It's not an egalitarian one. But I also think this reveals something about our status quo, which is quite ugly. It reveals that we are habituated to a misogynistic environment. That is the status quo for us. And that doesn't mean that every single person does misogynistic things, but rather that we can count on misogynistic things, including but not limited to hate speech, being perpetrated now and into the future because of this status quo. Third, I think it's really important not only to look at how hate speakers figure women in online comments, but it's also important to reflect on what impression concepts like hate speech convey to us. And while I do outline a set of conceptual guidelines in the book, as Rufus noted, as to what counts as hate speech and what does not, I have also argued that one of the great difficulties of discussing hate speech is that there isn't a good shared conception of the harm of hate speech. So on this matter, I would like to read a couple of excerpts from my 4th chapter. It is hard to find words to describe what it is like to inhabit a space that feels, because it looks, generally hostile. The difficulty in describing the harm of hate speech is partly because in our central ethico-political imaginary, harm is generally understood to be, or is seen as, direct and measurable. And what causes it is relatively straightforward. A hits B and B hurts. Such a narrow figuration makes it difficult to comprehend, let alone bear witness to, indirect, diffuse, and especially group harms. Perhaps this explains why several hate speech scholars have gravitated to a particular metaphorical image of the harms of hate speech. Hate speech as a toxic environmental pollutant, a sort of slow-acting poison accumulating here and there, word by word. Just like environmental pollution, we know that the tiny impacts of insignificant actions can accumulate into this toxic effect. And admittedly, there are advantages to such a figuration of hate speech. It mitigates the need to draw a direct causal line of harm from the utterance to one group, or even better, to one person from that one group. And instead, it forces us to look at the big picture, the impact on the social environment as a whole. It helps to convey why we should care about every instance of hate speech, even when someone may try to dismiss it as a joke or claim that the speech isn't harmful if the targets take no personal offence to what is said. Either way, these are still contributions to an environment that is becoming more and more toxic, less and less inhabitable. So if you can get how pollution works and why it's necessary to curb it, then you can get how hate speech works and why we need to eliminate the practice. But there's also a problem with the image. It conveys the idea that we begin with a pristine environment that our speech is subsequently degrading. And this is far from reality. Our history does not look like this. So an image that gets at hate speech being just one among many ever-present threats to one's living a secure life as a woman or as a queer person or as a person of color and so forth is video gaming. So video games usually have an aim, some sort of quest to achieve or a task for the agent to fulfill. But crucially, recognize how a lot of video games can be played with differing degrees of difficulty. The greater the difficulty of the game, the harder it is to achieve the aim. Some agents, due to luck of birth and circumstance, get to play this game on easy, which is to live in a less hostile environment. Others have to play it on hard, which means that there is more hostility out there and of many different kinds to be aware of. So I put it to you that to imagine or envision acts of hate speech as blows which diminish the video game avatar's health is an alternate image that more accurately reflects what the experience is like to belong to a group that is persistently targeted with hate speech. Now, it exists in a web of other hostilities, but the point is that people know you always have to be on guard. The next threat could be just a comment below. So, as law professor Catherine McKinnon argues, social inequality is substantially created and enforced, that is, done through words and images. Certain images of woman with a capital W, images which again are not new and did not predate the internet, and did not originate with the internet, are reproduced in hate speech against women online. And this perpetuates the status quo of terrestrial society. The online world and the physical environment in which we live are thoroughly imbricated with each other at this point. But let us not be lulled into thinking that there are no new images at play in assessing the problem of hate speech against women in the digital age. And this leads to my fifth point. One might be wondering what to do practically about this problem, and rightly so. Now, as Rufus outlined in the book, I do analyze different strategies, both formal and informal, institutional and social. And it includes things like, trying to make existing laws work to your advantage, introducing new laws, treating platforms like Facebook as if they're publishers and not just platforms for content. And so they have an additional responsibility to remove any hateful content that's there. Different algorithms, not just looking for hate speech, but actually trying to identify things that lead you down an extremist pathway. More content moderation and far more visibility about who moderates content, how many people are employed, how are they supported. All of this would be useful to the end of eliminating hate speech against women online. And then, of course, there are the direct routes of counter speech or speaking back. Now, protest is important, collective protest especially, but I'm skeptical, even in concert, that all of these ideas, even patchwork together, would solve the problem of hate speech against women online. Which is not to say that I don't endorse them, I do. I think that every single measure, warts and all, is better than nothing. But there is something missing from the list, and I call that something counter-imagining. So while I said that the images of women in online hate speech aren't new, the central digital imaginary is. It's been developing over the course of mere decades. Now, because I don't have time to analyze all of the images in this central imaginary, I'll focus on the one that typically gets the most attention, which is the troll. Now, the troll, capital T, stands in contrast to the tacitly assumed average internet user, people like you and me who would never think about saying anything hateful online. So the thinking goes, if we could just rid the internet of these trolls, then, you may reason, maybe all could experience equality online. Now, real name policies, such as those that Facebook has, for example, exhibit this type of underlying rationale. So the idea is that by requiring users to be themselves on the internet, it will make individuals feel compelled to conduct themselves according to shared moral and civic standards for public debate. Now, the inverse subject of this real name subject is an anonymous subject. And indeed, trolls are often thought to be these anonymous figures that lurk in the internet's shadows. But anonymity is a bit of a boogeyman here. Firstly, online sociability comes with varying degrees of anonymity, and staying anonymous is easier in some places and harder in others. Additionally, our real selves are already online. If anyone has a social media profile, if anyone has a Wikipedia page that's dedicated to them, if anyone's on Google Scholar, we are already on the internet. The list goes on. So just because it's not immediately apparent who the person behind the screen is, that also doesn't mean that it's difficult for law enforcement or just for you personally to find out necessarily. And finally, it also turns out that the real name's rationale isn't as discouraging as one would hope, because there are a great many people out there who are willing to engage in trolling even when they can be recognized as their real selves. And lest we forget, trolls are not monsters. They are ordinary members of society, and they are habituated to certain forms of behavior. So my point is this: if my analysis is correct, that we are habituated to misogynistic behaviors, which includes, but it is not limited to, hate speaking, that we're born into and made out of misogyny, that patriarchy is our inheritance and without intervention will be our legacy. It is obvious that all of the partial solutions I analyze in the book are band-aid solutions. This is a much deeper problem. If it really is the case that misogyny is thoroughly woven into the norms and practices of society, including our digital social spaces, then the oppression of women will continue. I think in order to go beyond a band-aid response, what we need to do is interrogate all of the images, the old and the new, so that we can start a process of counter-imagining, which is necessary to disrupt the status quo and engender a more egalitarian way of life. And this leads me to my sixth and final point. This wheel represents necessary features of an imaginal evolution, or revolution, if you will. That is to say, this is what's required if you want to change the status quo. It might not be sufficient, but it's necessary. Now, once you become familiar with the structure of social imaginaries theory, which I hope you will, should you choose to read my book, then I think it becomes very clear why these are necessary elements. So without duration, this is the time aspect, new meanings cannot cement themselves. Without noticing a contradiction within or across our shared imaginings, then the conditions of the status quo will remain. Without a desire to change those contradictions and frictions that emerge, then there is no will that's driving us to deal with those problems. Without critique, there's no clear sense of what precisely must change and what might be better than what we currently have now. Without resonance, there is no sense or communicability of an idea or a feeling. And without understanding how power is manifest in one's lived world, it's not very clear how to target our efforts for change or how we might get these efforts to endure. Of course, it remains to be seen whether the images that I have proposed regarding hate speech and harm will be found to exhibit these elements. But as for those images still to be brought to life, these criteria offer a handy evaluative guide to determine whether we should put certain new, borrowed, or repurposed images into circulation, hopefully for good and not for bad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. And that leaves us plenty of time for some questions from the audience. So we might start here in the room in Hobart. Do you have some questions?
I'm curious about your research process. At that point, it was a big time. Wondering how you got the data off the internet, what sort of way you looked and what happened. So, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Just wondering what the research process was, I guess, to inform the book. What you mentioned, around 6 months of work. I'm just wondering what that was.
Yes, so I decided that I had to collect my data manually. And part of the reason for doing this was because humans are very creative at not getting caught by algorithms when they want to say nasty things. They misspell words on purpose, they put punctuation in instead of certain letters, and they skirt the guidelines in that way. Also, sometimes hate speech can be quite subtle. It doesn't come out in the form of slurs. The other reason that I wanted to collect the data manually was because I wanted to inhabit an online social space and experience what it felt like to be a woman in an online space, and to not be the subject of attack, but to witness how frequently the misogyny and sexism came up. So I chose a platform, which was Facebook, partly because I had at that point used Facebook for years to get my news rather than going to specific newspapers. I chose one site because I knew that I didn't have the capacity as a manual data taker to cover multiple different outlets. And the site that I chose was the Australians Facebook page. And I took the Facebook comments, not the comments from the platform itself. I make no assumptions about the commentators' political leanings, because anyone across the political spectrum can and did exhibit sexism and misogyny. So even when people who were more left-leaning came in to dress down, putting it politely, the people who are more conservative or right-leaning, sometimes this was, sheer critique, and other times it just evolved into people calling each other horrific things or using kind of gendered terms in order to undercut problems. So I ended up waking up every day at 6 o'clock in the morning, spent 1 hour on Facebook on the Australians page. I would look for any posts that they had made, because the whole of the newspaper doesn't go onto Facebook. They content create, they craft what is on Facebook. And I would look for any articles which were either about a specific woman or written by a woman, which featured an image of women in the thumbnail on the Facebook feed, or which were about known gendered topics. So things like the gender pay gap and work-life balance, can she have it all? Those kinds of articles as well. And I would read the comments. If there were more than 100 comments, I would cap myself at 100. And I would do that by taking only the primary comment and none of the replies. And if it was fewer than 100 comments, I would take the original comment and the replies as well. Then I thematically analysed it. So basically, I just sat there and I read through 6 months worth of daily misogyny and sexism, had to carve out the line, which was, okay, does this meet my criteria for hate speech, or is this not quite up to the threshold of being that severe? And so I ended up actually with a lot of data sort of sitting on the side, which is problematic and contributes to women's oppression, but isn't hate speech. So I have more work to do there to learn from that data. But there was only one day, August 28th of 2018, where there were no misogynistic or sexist comments at all in those online spaces. So I had my work cut out for me. Sometimes it was just an hour a day. Sometimes it was like 2 to 3 hours to get it all. And at the end, having lived that experientially, I did not want to go on Facebook for a while. And that is actually part of what I argue in the book, that like you create a space that's hostile about women, not to women, about women, then women don't want to be there. And that's essentially creating a hostile environment. And that's a form of discrimination. So it perpetuates women's oppression in that way as well. It's not just the content of what's said, but it's also how you mold those social spaces to make them more welcoming or more hostile.
Thanks.
Greg, do you have a question from online or should I go to the audience here? Yes. Oh, I can. Louise, right here.
Yeah.
As online hate speech is global, how do we extend cultural change why revoked social imaginary when the First Amendment absolutism in the US dominates so much policy and information?
It's such a great question. And I'm so happy that someone noticed that when Australians talk about hate speech and free speech, they're doing it from a perspective that's been majorly influenced by US debate. Australia is not America, you guys. Our system is different. We do different things and have different norms, but it speaks to the power of the framing, right? And one of the only tactics that I can even think of for recalibrating an imaginary around free speech and hate speech is to create some sort of sever, a break in the dialogue where we can focus on our national context and our national history, because we do have some laws in place at the federal level and at state levels, whether they're civil or criminal, that relate to certain sorts of speech deemed hateful. Often it's called vilification. Probably everybody is familiar with the Racial Discrimination Act and Section 18C, offend, insult, humiliate. So what we need to do, I think, is backtrack in order to reassert images that were previously successful in generating changes in Australian society. When at the federal level, the debate was being had about whether to include 18C and the associated subsections into the Racial Discrimination Act. If you look at the Hansard transcripts, there are people there who say, Australia is an equal society, equality was achieved ages ago, this is unnecessary, it's too much of an infringement on people's rights. And that's what people are saying now, and that's what people used to say. But then there are also people there who speak to situated positionality, who say, like, look at us parliamentarians. We are in the majority in 1995, white Anglo-Saxon men. We have not had the same experiences that these people have had. And it would be presumptuous of us to assume that if anyone pointed out our whiteness, that it would be as harmful as it is when you point out someone's indigeneity, for example. So I think this is a moment for, rather than the creation of a new image, or jettison one, I think we need to reappropriate. That's what I think we need to do. And America is kind of a cultural behemoth, so I'm not sure if we actually can reappropriate. We might just have to sidestep and go down a different path. But we need to somehow close that imaginary back down to the dominant Australian social imaginary, not the dominant Western social imaginary. Because at that level, America dominates.
Kristen.
Thanks for such a fascinating and insightful discussion of your work, Louise. very engaging. I had a question for you. You've explained how you used Facebook, and that is a platform that demands that we show, well, something of our true selves, if you
Mm.
like. I was curious to know, when you spent your 6 months, which was mind-boggling really, doing your manual data collection and dealing with all of these posts and the horror of them, did you notice whether very many were actually made by women? And if so, what sort of percent would you imagine were made by women about and against other women?
I can tell you the exact answer to that question. I just need to grab a copy of my book. So among my other amazing images that I've created to explain the social imaginary, I also created a nice little pie chart which has the statistics. So out of my larger pool of misogynistic and sexist comments, there were 2,881 instances of hate speech. Men's comments, presumed because of the gender of the username, so it may not actually be men, were responsible for 2,048 of that total. And then there were people with feminine names who I take to be women, but who might not have been women, who contributed 588 instances of hate speech. And then I have a section for ambiguous comments as well, because some people are commenting from a Facebook page, or it's what, you know, there's a couple who have a shared Facebook account and you don't know which one of the couple is actually doing the speaking. So they're classified as ambiguous. So statistically, 71% of the data set, men, 20% women, 9% ambiguous. So yeah, there's women out there and they're getting in on it. But overall, men tend to be much more prolific commentators online than women do. Although I have read research which shows that when you're talking about racist hate speech rather than hate speech against women, that it's roughly even. Yeah. I read that after I published this book, so it's not in here. You just have to take me for my word.
Greg, do we have a question on that?
Thank you. Inspired by experience, which you respond in theory into a real world solution. Can you talk to the theory activists provide and how we as academics can more productively possibly provide while maintaining the power of independence?
Sure. I have had experiences of being the subject of hate speech online, but interestingly, this didn't happen to me until after I'd already started researching hate speech against women online. So I provocatively wrote an article and titled it "Offending White Men," because it was about white men who were making complaints about racial discrimination on the grounds of hate speech. Anyway, the white men got angry, and then suddenly there was a blog post, and then suddenly people on Facebook were commenting on the blog post, and I just stumbled onto it by accident. And I had this thought at the time. It was still very on, like I hadn't yet commenced the DECRA, and I was just doing some kind of seed research into the topic, but it did make me think, like, this speech is not intended for me. If it was intended for me, someone would have tried to tag me in it somehow, or they would have sent me a direct message. So who's it for? And what's it doing? So I've got instances of comments that I cite at the beginning of the book, which are, you know, very in keeping with the images that are actually reproduced in hate speech about women in general. I'll just take one that's not too slurry. So one was, "She needs to spend her time more constructively by making me a sandwich." Another one was, "She's a female? Damn." And another one was, who is this feminazi? Never heard of him. So I was like, wow, what a strange phenomenon. So my experiences of being the subject of hate speech or the token of hate speech did in a way shape the nature of the argument in this book, because it made me realize something about the phenomenon that I had not read in any other academic account of hate speech against women. And there's actually very little of it in philosophy as a discipline anyway. But amongst the social sciences literature, the emerging digital studies literature, people were talking about impacts on individuals, and there was just this gaping hole of the impact on groups. And I thought it was really necessary to say something about that, because I don't think the problem is agent to agent. I think the problem is social and structural, and it's not going to end anytime soon if we don't start treating it as such. In terms of maintaining independence, everything that I write for me. I mean, I know like it's my job to write things, but I write about subjects that I think matter and that I think should matter to our community as well. So, you know, if I hadn't have been so fortunate as to have been awarded this DECRA and had the time to exclusively focus on writing this monograph, I probably still would have ended up writing it. It just would have taken 6 years instead of 3 years. And also I'm increasingly starting to make my research more personal, which is probably not what you would expect, but I'm starting to write myself into theory more often, because the problems that I want to understand are problems that relate to me, not because I'm the subject of it necessarily, but because I'm in relation to others within my community. So increasingly, academia is becoming a space of the personal and the political, and there isn't really a strict divide between, you know, what is for work and what is for me, and, you know, what I owe to people.
Thank you. As an old white male, can I ask, given the Supreme Court decision recently in the US, do you think the problem is religious?
Are you talking about the abortion?
I'm talking about the entrenched attitudes to women.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that religions as practice in our history have involved a patriarchal social structure, and to that extent probably still retain some structures of prejudice based on gender. But we've also gone through a process of social secularization, and the problem hasn't gone away just because we leave God out of it or less people consider themselves to be believers. There's something very entrenched about patriarchy that really can't be attributed just to religion or even primarily to religion. But as with, I think, most things, people at the more extreme end of the spectrum would definitely exhibit greater disrespect to women than at its least extreme point. So yeah, I think religions of all varieties play a role, but we're all believers of something. If we're not believers in a higher power, we do believe in some sort of moral code. We do have ideas about what society should be like. We do have beliefs about the appropriate way to conduct ourselves in this certain situation, or with our partner at home, you know, out at a restaurant. So, you know, we've all got a meaning generating narrative that drives us to act in particular ways. Religion is one way of having a meaning generating narrative, but it's not the only type of narrative that can be circulating in one's milieu.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. We've got 1 more here on the floor, and then do we have another one online, Greg?
Oh,
We'll have 1 more here, and then we'll have 1 more online. Here.
Hi there. I was just wondering about, I guess, where to from here, and particularly your example of the Facebook page of The Australian, which doesn't sound like a particularly fun place to be. But how much you have a sense of whether, in terms of that, in changing these social imaginaries and power, platforms like Facebook and institutions like The Australian and media are on board with this idea of changing these imaginaries? Because it seems to me, this is not my background at all, but they benefit from people being there in these debates, but at the same time they lose people who don't want to be there when they become too hostile. So yeah, what's your sense of where the appetite for change?
What I think is really interesting is the impression that people have about platforms. You may recall when the former government was trying to pass a bill that would force payment to news outlets so that their content could be hosted on the site. And Facebook wasn't backing down, and then they just lopped everything off. Everything that came from a news outlet got deleted if you'd shared it. So stuff was missing from your profile, pages were blank, everything was gone. And then I recall watching a Q&A episode where, the question was not around, this is an organization exerting extreme control over what can and cannot be said and who does or does not have access to information. This is our marketplace. This is where we go to have our ideas. And isn't this government responsible for making sure that we have that environment? So part of the images that need to be reevaluated are not just based on identity, they're also about how do we conceive the platform? We think of it as our new public sphere, basically. It's taken over the role, and it's allowed us to be more active in it than we were with traditional media, which was passive. So, and I think as well, that example speaks to the bad faith of these mega tech corporations, because simultaneously almost, there was a bill being passed in Australia to ban cyber abuse against adults. Pathbreaking, world leading. I'm not joking. Did any of you know that? Right? So everyone knew about the news bill, but nobody knew that we were trying to actually create legislation that would make these online spaces less hostile for adults specifically. So this is part of the problem as well. Facebook demonstrated that it has the power to change things dramatically like that. And yet it doesn't do so when it comes to the matter of hate speech. And again, it comes down to the bottom line. It's a corporation at the end of the day, but we don't think of it as such, and that's part of the problem. So where to from here is challenging more images.
1 more question from online.
Lots of questions based around the answer that you just gave, Louise, but the last question was there any intersection between misogyny and racism or ethnocentrism?
Sorry, that is actually my alarm going off. My mistake. It's reminding me to take my pills because I'm an old sick lady these days. I'm sorry, could you just repeat the last part of that question, Greg? Thank you.
So the intersection between misogyny and racism.
Yep.
In the Australian context.
Yep.
Women are more targeted than white.
They don't seem to be. There's definitely racialized hate speech in the database, but it isn't there in such a reliable way that you can make generalizations about it. Something interesting that I noticed when I was looking specifically at the example of what I called failed women, those were the types of statements where there was purposeful misgendering and denial of trans identity, and used in such a way as to denigrate women as if it's like offensive to somehow resemble a man in some kind of way. I don't know, times have changed, I guess, from 10 years ago. But what I found really interesting there was sexuality was a predictor. So anyone who was publicly known to be a lesbian would be targeted with this type of speech. And yet people from different racial backgrounds, some of them were targeted and others weren't. And there was no discernible rationale for why people would choose to pick one or the other. So there's a lot more to unpack in terms of an intersectional analysis. But what I've found so far is that the patterns are unstable. And I think it's probably a product of what's happening in the news at the time as well. So one of the things that was happening at the very beginning of my data collection was Serena Williams losing the Australian Open, and then that racist cartoon was published about her. A lot of racist misogyny, a lot. But then, you know, things changed to the, you know, the leadership spill, and then suddenly everybody hated Julie Bishop and she was the center of attention. Karen Phelps, nobody likes her. Apparently she's on the left, in the center and on the right, according to the Facebook commentators. So yeah, I think it's just very much a reflection more of what's in the news cycle, but it's there, it's interconnected. You will absolutely find instances of it.
Thank you so much, Louise, and thank you to our audience here and online for joining us for what has been a really terrific event. I have a few thank yous before we finish up. So of course, I want to thank Rufus. Thank you very much for launching the book this evening. Thanks to Greg Marshall, without whom this event would not have happened. Also to Rebecca Rule and Kate Darian-Smith, who've been terrific supporters organising the event. And this evening, Andy Terrell and Liam Ma, who are filming the event for us and making sure we have a terrific record of this evening's event. And thanks also to Saxon Hornet for his work with the AV equipment as well. So thank you, and please join me in a round of applause. Thank you everyone for